Imagine standing on a field littered with the bodies of 100,000 soldiers, the air thick with smoke and the metallic stench of blood, watching the most feared army in human history turn their backs and run, not retreat in an organized, tactical withdrawal, not fall back to regroup, but run, in full, panicked, desperate flight, pursued by the very men they had come to slaughter. Now, imagine that this was the first time in over 4 decades that anyone had ever seen the Mongols do this. The first time in 40 years of conquest. In 40 years of burning cities to the ground, drowning entire civilizations in rivers of blood, and erasing empires that had stood for centuries. This was the first time someone had made them run. On September 3rd, 1260, a small spring in modern-day Palestine called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. And what happened there that day didn't just stop an army. It changed the entire course of human history. But to truly understand why this moment was so extraordinary, so almost impossible, we first have to understand exactly what kind of monster the Mongols were. Because nothing in your imagination will come close to the reality. The Mongol Empire did not conquer the world gradually, the way most empires do, slowly, generation by generation, grinding their way forward through decades of careful expansion. No, the Mongols exploded onto the world stage like a force of nature that no one had a word for yet. It began with one man, Genghis Khan, a child who had been abandoned on the steppes of Central Asia, enslaved as a teenager, and left for dead more times than history can count. And yet from those brutal beginnings rose the most brilliant military mind the ancient world had ever produced. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled by a single ruler in the history of our species. But here is what most people don't fully appreciate. Genghis Khan dying did not slow the Mongols down, not even slightly. His sons and grandsons carried the torch further, wider, deeper. By the 1230s, the Mongols had crushed the Jin dynasty of northern China. By the early 1240s, they had stormed through Russia, Poland, and Hungary, reaching the gates of Vienna before the death of a great Khan forced their armies back east. Think about that for a moment. Vienna. They were at Vienna. The Mongols were standing at the doorstep of Western Europe, and the only thing that saved those kingdoms was an accident of timing. A leader dying thousands of miles away. That is how close the world came to a very different fate. But it was what happened in the Middle East that concerns us today. And nothing illustrates the terror of the Mongol war machine better than what they did to Baghdad in the year 1258. Baghdad at that time was not just a city. It was the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. It was home to the greatest library in the world, the House of Wisdom, where scholars had spent centuries collecting, translating, and preserving the knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt. It was a city of over 1 million people. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of the Islamic world, a place that had stood for 500 years. And in February of 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan surrounded it, breached its walls, and unleashed a slaughter so complete, so total, so absolute, that historians are still debating the death toll today. Estimates range from 200,000 dead to over 1 million. The streets reportedly ran with blood. The Tigris River, by eyewitness accounts, ran black with the ink of the thousands upon thousands of books hurled into it from the destroyed library. The Caliph himself, the symbolic successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the most powerful religious figure in the Islamic world, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, because Mongol tradition held that royal blood could not be spilled on the ground. Baghdad fell in a matter of days. 500 years of civilization. Are you beginning to understand now why the rest of the world was not just afraid of the Mongols, but paralyzed with fear? If you're finding this story as gripping as the history itself, Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now because we cover stories exactly like this one every single week. The moments in history that sound too extraordinary to be real, but are absolutely true. After Baghdad, Hulagu Khan continued his march westward. The great city of Aleppo fell. Damascus surrendered without a fight, its terrified leaders simply opening the gates and begging for mercy. The Mongols now controlled virtually the entire Middle East, and the next prize on their list was Egypt. Egypt, the last major Muslim power still standing in the region. The last thing between the Mongols and complete dominance of the known world. And here's the question that must have been burning in every Egyptian's mind in the year 1260. Who on earth was going to stop them? Not the Crusaders, certainly. The Christian kingdoms that still clung to the edges of the Holy Land were too weak, too fractured, too consumed by their own internal politics. There were actually Crusader leaders at this time who genuinely believed the Mongols might be allies, because some Mongol generals had Christian wives, and there were rumors of a Mongol ruler converting. It was wishful thinking. The Mongols were loyal to no religion and no alliance. They were loyal to conquest, not the remaining Seljuk Turks either. They had already been shattered, not the remnants of the Abbasid dynasty. They were dead. The world was running out of answers, and the Mongol tide was still rising. Which brings us to a group of people that history, in many ways, has still not given their full due. The Mamluks. The word Mamluk literally means owned in Arabic. They were slaves, military slaves specifically, a practice that sounds paradoxical to modern ears but was deeply embedded in medieval Islamic society. For centuries, the caliphs and sultans of the Islamic world had purchased young boys from the steppes of Central Asia, from the Caucasus, from Turkey, boys who had no family connections, no tribal loyalties, no political ambitions of their own. These boys were brought to Egypt and trained from childhood to be the most elite soldiers in the Islamic world. They were given the best weapons, the best horses, the best military education available. And crucially, they were loyal only to whoever owned them. But over time, something shifted. The Mamluks grew powerful enough to realize they didn't need to be owned anymore. In 1250, in a moment of extraordinary audacity, the Mamluks of Egypt assassinated the last sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty, the dynasty founded by the legendary Saladin himself, and seized power for themselves. Former slaves, now kings. It is one of the most remarkable political reversals in medieval history. And the man who now sat at the head of this Mamluk Sultanate, the man who would have to face the Mongols, was a warrior named Saif ad-Din Qutuz. Now here is where the story gets truly fascinating, because Qutuz was not born into Egyptian royalty. He was not a prince, not a nobleman, not someone who had lived his entire life in comfort and power. Qutuz was himself a Mamluk, a former slave, sold into service as a boy, who had climbed through talent, ferocity, and political skill to become sultan. And he had deeply personal reasons to hate the Mongols. According to historical accounts, Qutuz may have been a Khwarezmian prince, part of a royal family destroyed by the Mongols decades earlier. He had watched what they did to the world he came from. He understood, better than perhaps anyone else alive, exactly what was at stake if Egypt fell. When Mongol ambassadors arrived in Cairo demanding Egypt's submission, as they had demanded of every kingdom before it, Qutuz did something that was, by any reasonable measure, suicidal in its boldness. He had them executed, all of them. He cut off their heads and mounted them on the gates of Cairo. It was a declaration of war so provocative, so deliberate, that it left no room for diplomacy, no room for retreat. Either the Mamluks destroyed the Mongols, or the Mongols destroyed Egypt. There was no third option. If this story is already blowing your mind, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more history lovers who need to hear stories like this one. Qutuz began preparing for war. And in doing so, he made an alliance that was almost as remarkable as the battle itself. His second in command, a brilliant and ferocious Mamluk general named Baybars, had actually been Qutuz's political enemy not long before. The two men had been rivals, and Baybars had even fled Egypt at one point, fearing for his life. But the Mongol threat was too enormous for old grudges to survive. Qutuz recalled Baybars, restored him to command, and the two men, former enemies, became the partnership that would change history. Baybars was extraordinary. He had already fought the Mongols once before at the Battle of Pelusium in 1260, and had managed to withdraw his forces intact, a rare achievement against an enemy who specialized in turning retreats into massacres. He understood Mongol tactics intimately. He knew how they fought, how they thought, how they pursued, and that knowledge was about to become the most valuable military intelligence in the world. The Mongol force marching toward Egypt was commanded by a general named Kitbuka, a veteran commander, an Nestorian Christian, and by all accounts a man of tremendous personal courage. His army was not the full strength of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu Khan had pulled back a significant portion of his forces to deal with political turmoil back east following the death of the great Khan monk. But Kitbuka's remaining army was still formidable, still composed of some of the finest cavalry soldiers the medieval world had ever produced, still armed with the tactics and the psychological terror that had brought every enemy before them to their knees. The two armies converged in the Jezreel Valley in modern-day Israel, a wide, flat plain framed by hills, close to spring the locals called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, named, according to tradition, for the very spot where the young shepherd David had once faced the giant Philistine warrior and brought him down with a single stone. If history has a sense of irony, it was working overtime that day. Qutuz and Baybars did not simply march out and meet the Mongols in open battle. That would have been catastrophic. The Mongols excelled at open-field cavalry engagements. It was precisely the environment they had dominated for decades. Instead, the Mamluks used the Mongols' own tactics against them. Baybars took a smaller, faster vanguard force and placed himself directly in the Mongols' path, visible, provocative, seemingly vulnerable. The rest of the Mamluk army was concealed in the hills and forests around the valley, waiting. The plan was to lure the Mongols into pursuit, draw them deep into the valley, and then spring the trap. Now ask yourself honestly, would you have trusted that plan? Would you have been willing to be the man riding out in front of the most feared army on earth, counting on your hidden allies not to break and run before the signal? That took nerves that most human beings simply do not possess. Baybars did it anyway. The battle began on the morning of September 3rd, 1260. Baybars' vanguard made contact with the Mongol force and fought, hard enough to seem like a real engagement, but not so effectively as to stop the Mongol advance. Then, exactly as planned, they fell back, and the Mongols, sensing a rout, pursued. They galloped into the valley, certain they were about to run down a fleeing enemy. And that is when Qutuz unleashed everything. The hidden Mamluk forces poured out of the hills from multiple sides simultaneously. What had moments earlier looked like a Mongol pursuit became a desperate Mongol fight for survival. Kitbuka's army found itself surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting in terrain that stripped away every advantage their open-step tactics relied upon. For the first time in living memory, the Mongols were the ones reacting, not attacking. The ones scrambling, not dictating. But the Mongols did not simply collapse. They were too well-trained, too experienced for that. There was a terrifying moment mid-battle when the Mongols launched a furious counterattack on the left flank of the Mamluk line, and that flank began to buckle. Soldiers started to break. And if the left flank collapsed completely, the entire battle plan would unravel. The trap would become a disaster. This is the moment where Qutuz himself made the decision that perhaps more than any other single action determined the outcome of the day. He tore the helmet from his head so his soldiers could see his face and drove his horse straight into the collapsing flank, screaming his battle cry at the top of his lungs. Wa Islama, roughly translated, "O my Islam," a cry of desperate faith and fury in one. His soldiers saw their Sultan hatless, exposed, throwing himself into the breach, and they steadied. They held. The flank did not break. The fighting continued through the morning and into the afternoon. And then slowly, with crushing inevitability, the weight of numbers and position began to tell. The Mongol formation fragmented. Their cavalry, the instrument of their terror, had no room to maneuver, no open ground to use their speed and their arrows. They were being cut apart. Kitbuka himself fought until the very end. He was captured, reportedly still defiant, still proud, before being executed on the field. And his army? His army ran. For the first time in 40 years of conquest, a Mongol army broke and fled in full retreat. The Mamluks pursued them for miles, cutting down as many as they could, making absolutely certain that no force large enough to regroup and counterattack made it out of the valley intact. By the time the sun set over the Jezreel Valley that evening, the Battle of Ain Jalut was over, and the world, though it didn't fully understand it yet, had changed. We want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us. Do you think history remembers the Mamluks fairly? Do you think they get the credit they deserve for saving not just the Islamic world, but potentially all of Europe? Drop your thoughts down below. We read every single comment. The immediate consequences were enormous. Within weeks, the Mamluk army swept through Syria, recapturing Damascus and Aleppo. The Mongol garrisons left behind, stripped of the main army that had terrified everyone into submission, found themselves without backup, without reinforcement, and were destroyed or expelled one by one. The Mongol advance into the Middle East did not just stall after Ain Jalut. It stopped permanently. They would attempt to retake Syria several more times in the decades that followed. And each single time, the Mamluks turned them back. The frontier held. The line held. But the deeper significance of Ain Jalut goes far beyond the tactical or even the strategic. Think about what the Mongol advance had already done to human civilization by 1260. Baghdad destroyed. The House of Wisdom gone. Countless cities across Persia, Iraq, and Syria reduced to rubble. The population of the Islamic heartland cut, by some historical estimates, by as much as half. If Egypt had fallen, if the Mamluks had lost that day, there was nothing left. Nothing between the Mongols and the complete obliteration of what remained of Islamic civilization. And beyond that, nothing to prevent a renewed push into Africa, into Europe from the south and east simultaneously. The geopolitical map of our entire modern world might look unrecognizable. Make sure you've hit the notification bell so you never miss a video like this one, because next week we're covering another one of history's most jaw-dropping turning points, and you will not want to wake up and find out you missed it. There's also the story of what happened after, because history, as always, refuses to be simple or clean. Qutuz did not enjoy his victory for long. Within weeks of his triumph at Ain Jalut, on the road back to Egypt, he was assassinated. And the man who killed him, or at least the man who led the conspiracy that killed him, was Baybars, the very general who had helped win the battle. The man whose tactical genius had been central to the greatest victory of the age turned on the Sultan who had trusted him, seized the throne for himself, and became one of the most powerful rulers in Mamluk history. Baybars went on to continue fighting the Mongols for decades, winning battle after battle. And he is considered by many historians to be one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval era. But the manner of his rise, the knife in the back of the man who had pardoned him, trusted him, and fought beside him, casts a long shadow over his legacy. What do you make of a man like that? A brilliant hero and a cold-blooded schemer in the same skin? History is full of them, and they never stop being complicated. The Battle of Ain Jalut deserves to be one of the most famous battles in human history. It arguably deserves to sit alongside Thermopylae Marathon and Waterloo in the public consciousness. A moment when the course of civilization genuinely hung in the balance and was pulled back from the edge by a group of men who had no reason to believe they could win, but fought anyway. And yet, outside of specialist circles, outside of the Islamic world, where it is still remembered with pride, it remains obscure, overlooked, unknown to the vast majority of people who walk around every day on a planet that was shaped, in no small part, by what happened at that small spring in Palestine on a September morning in 1260. Maybe that's the most important reason to tell the story. Not just because it's thrilling, though it absolutely is. Not just because it's dramatic, though the drama is extraordinary. But because the people who stopped the Mongols were not the people that the Western historical tradition has spent centuries celebrating. They were African-based warriors of Central Asian origin, former slaves who had seized their own freedom, fighting under a banner of faith and survival on the edge of the desert. They saved the world, and the world largely forgot to thank them. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, the day the unstoppable was stopped. If this story moved you the way it moved me when I first discovered it, share this video with someone who loves history, or someone who thinks they don't. Because the real story of our world is always stranger, always more brutal, always more heroic than anything we could make up. And it is always worth remembering.